Jeff Crilley, normally interviews people, but today he is being interviewed. I want to open up with a verse here out of Acts 13:36. It said, when David had served God's purpose, he fell asleep and was buried. It really is all about discovering God's purpose. And I chose to interview Jeff because Jeff has had an amazing career. But I want Jeff to tell the story that many of you do not know. And that is how he even got into this field. I get the opportunity to meet Jeff several weeks ago and was just really touched by his heart, his desire to give people a voice. And as I said before, your story is God's glory. And I believe that Jeff does that and gives the opportunity to many, many people to share their story so that God would be glorified. And so, Jeff, I want you to begin and tell everybody some of the things that they don't know about yourself and how you got started in this, going back to when you were just a child.
Sure. So my dad, still with us today,
Yes.
He's 89, and he was a minister in downtown Detroit. And he took it upon himself to become the voice of the homeless in Detroit. So every time it got cold in Detroit in September and October, he would call the local TV stations and newspapers and say, hey, this is Reverend Bob from just down the street. And I know you do stories about the homeless when it gets cold. And we feed 700 homeless people every single Wednesday. Wow. And would love to have you come down and meet some of our fine homeless people and hear their stories. And so as a boy, I just remembered TV cameras being in the church.
Wow.
And then every Easter, they had a balloon launch, and then later it became a dove launch. And then every Christmas, he'd call up the TV stations and say, hey, I know you like to do stories about worship, and you're welcome into my sanctuary. And I just remembered these icons in TV news in Detroit in the 70s. I'm going to call it the Ron Burgundy days, when everybody watched the news, and they didn't just know the main anchors, they knew the reporters.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking as a little boy, wow, that would be cool. It would be cool to be a reporter. And so then I ended up going to Michigan State University. Michigan State University has a good communication school. They also had a little public access television station off campus. I started to volunteer as a news anchor on cable access. And then I got an internship at the local TV station and kind of worked my way up to weekend anchor by the time I was graduating college.
No kidding.
Yeah.
So you had watched your parents serving in the homeless.
Yes.
And so tell a bit more about what it was to see your parents serving and how that impacted you in regards to not only the decision you made to be a broadcaster, but how it impacted you as seeing other people being served.
Sure. I think I channel my dad every single day.
Yeah.
People will compliment me and they say, man, I see God on your face. I see this joy about you. And I truly get it from my dad. My dad, if he was in the checkout line at Kroger's, he'd start striking up a conversation with the checker and minister to her. And so I just, I love how my dad goes around the planet just loving on people.
Gotcha.
And so I'm now about to be 61. I feel like I'm just getting started, but I do think my father had cracked the code on what life is about. Mm-hmm. It's really about being a blessing to other people.
Gotcha.
And like listening with your heart. Mm-hmm. I think we're living in a society right now where everybody's talking and nobody's listening. Mm-hmm. And we need to go back to really getting in tune with humanity.
Yeah. Yeah. So tell a little bit about, my mom, you did not know that, actually grew up in Detroit.
Oh, wow.
Tell about what life was like back then in Detroit. And you were how old when you kind of got to observe some things your dad did?
Moved to Detroit when I was 5.
Okay.
And the race riots in Detroit were 1968. We moved there in 1969.
Wow, okay.
And my father tells the story that as he's climbing up in the ministerial world, he had a choice to go to Denver, downtown Denver, or downtown Detroit. And my mom tells the story, when he chose Detroit, she cried because the only thing she knew about Detroit was what she saw on the national news, where it was burning down and the National Guard was being called in. But my father got the call from God that, Denver doesn't need you right now. Detroit needs you. And so the blessing to me is, if you look at my kindergarten picture, it's 50-50 white, black. If you look at my 6th grade picture, I'm one of 2 white kids in the entire school. Wow. And so I actually experienced as a child white flight to the suburbs. Well, if you're a white kid in an all-black school, you need to learn how to talk. You need to learn how to get along. So I learned kind of the gift of gab and relating to people, and I was actually a popular kid in an all-black school. And then throughout my news career, so many times I'm covering a story in an all-black neighborhood, and people pick up on are you comfortable or are you uncomfortable? And just to this day, I can be the only white guy in a room, and I'm completely at home.
Yeah. Well, let's talk more about that, because it's interesting, because I grew up in Illinois, the southern part of Illinois, and I grew up in the projects. And so actually my first girlfriend was black. Okay. So it's cool. And there's a certain comfort level, and I personally did not see color.
Yes.
And so you grew up in an environment, and when did you say you moved in when you were 5?
Yes.
Okay.
So 1969.
Yeah. And so you grew up in predominantly a black neighborhood, went to a school and predominantly black.
Yes.
And then, so your dad was very much involved in what was going on in that community. So talk more. And then I heard that he was very much involved in the homeless. So what was his driving force, and how that impacted you?
Sure. So Eminem, the rap star, came out with a movie a couple decades ago called 8 Mile. Okay. And for people who are familiar with Detroit, 9 Mile is Ferndale. 9 Mile is the suburbs. Okay. And I lived at 7 Mile. So I joke that the only thing more dangerous than 8 Mile is 7 Mile. And I don't think anybody's been to 6 Mile. Okay. It was a dangerous time to live in Detroit, where everything you paid through bulletproof glass, everything. I remember sitting in a Chinese restaurant where there were linen tablecloths, and you're being served in a traditional Chinese restaurant, but behind the cashier was behind bulletproof glass inside of a restaurant. And I'm just telling those stories because I think, I grew up in this area where you had to be afraid of getting mugged, and little boys didn't go to the candy store, and you were on guard all the time. And I just, thank God for that experience. I saw how loving my dad was to homeless people on the streets of Detroit. In fact, I'll tell you a story. You just reminded me of a story. So there were often homeless people in the coffee hour after the sermon on Sunday. It was not unusual to see several homeless people just hanging out. And there was this one gentleman, I've forgotten his name now, but he had a long overcoat, and he would wear that throughout the year. And my father tells the story that it was August, it was hot in Detroit. He saw this gentleman pacing in front of the church. And so my father goes out, and they start walking together. And my father makes an observation. He says, I couldn't help noticing that you're stepping over the cracks. And the homeless man who had some mental health issues stopped, and his eyes got big, and he said, "Reverend Bob, you don't know?" My dad says, "No, I don't know." And he says, "If you step on a crack, the earth opens up and swallows you whole." And instead of my father judging him or correcting him or jumping up and down on the crack to prove to him that was not true, my father said, I think the most loving thing you could say, "I had no idea.
Wow.
Thank you." And then they walked down the street stepping over the cracks together. And why that story touches me is I think if you can get on the planet of somebody who has a mental health issue, you can relate to anyone. And I think at the end of the day, we're all just 3 and 4-year-old children wanting the all-loving mom or dad. Hopefully, if you came from a nice home, you got the goo goo gaga. You're so wonderful. We're all seeking that unconditional love of a parent.
Yeah. Well, you were blessed because were your parents together, married together? Okay.
Still together.
Yeah.
And
you had the opportunity not only to be mentored and guided by your dad, who really illustrated and demonstrated servant leadership.
Yes.
And he ministered to what I would call what Jesus said, the ones that we were called to minister, people who were without clothes, people who needed food and home. And so how did that impact you, not only as a child, but growing up, especially as you said you're 61?
Yep.
Reflecting back on how you now look at people around you, and you interview various people, and you live here in Dallas.
Sure. Well, I have this vision that, we God's driving the car. We're in the
Yeah.
passenger seat. We can suggest, hey, God, shouldn't we take a right here? But ultimately, God's going to take us wherever God's going to take us.
Mm-hmm.
And I have this idea that if I got a flat tire, at one point I knew how to change a flat. I don't remember anymore.
Mm.
If I had a flat, I'd be bummed out. Okay, this is inconvenient.
Yeah.
I'd call the wrecker service, and I would try to, instead of getting mad at the situation, say, well, I guess God has somebody I need to meet.
Mm.
Maybe the wrecker guy needs a pep talk.
Yeah.
And because my father has been so good at these pep talks, it comes natural to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I see God in people, and I would I'd strike up a conversation with the tow truck driver, and hopefully minister to the tow truck driver.
Yeah. Yeah.
But if you take that attitude, then nothing bad can ever happen to you,
Yeah.
because it's just, who am I supposed to meet next, God?
Yeah. Now, how long did you live in Detroit with your dad as
Sure.
a minister?
So I went to Michigan State when I was 18,
Okay.
and then never moved back to Detroit. My first market was Lansing, Michigan, and then
Okay.
Omaha, Nebraska, Minneapolis, Minnesota for 4 very cold years,
Wow.
and then Dallas for 15 years as a reporter here in Dallas.
Okay. And where do your parents live now?
Waco.
Okay.
Yeah,
So they settled here in Texas.
they did, and so we get to see them, for birthdays and anniversaries. And
Okay. Now, do you have any other siblings?
I do. I have an older brother who is a minister in Grapevine,
Okay.
and a younger brother who is still living in the Detroit area. He's a
Gotcha.
professional illustrator and writer.
Okay. Fantastic.
Yeah.
We will be right back after these messages. Thank you so much. Welcome back to On Purpose with Paul. We are here with Jeff, and Jeff's telling us a little bit about behind the scenes of what makes Jeff Crilley who he is. And you were kind of telling us how the impact your father made. And I wanted to ask you, because you just mentioned before the break that your brother was a minister.
Mm-hmm. Still is.
Yeah. And so what impact did your parents have, not only on your brother, but you, because you ended up going to school to be a broadcaster?
Yes. So I'll start with my brother. I remember as a little boy, we're driving home from the sermon, and my older brother, Bob, is giving my dad show notes. He's 12, and he's saying, Dad, at that point in the sermon, you probably should have hit it a little harder, and I would have told another story. And I'm thinking to myself, because I was like 10 at the time.
Yeah.
I'm thinking to myself, my 12-year-old brother is critiquing my father. And so then he went into the ministry himself, and my brother and father are great storytellers. And so I think that if there's a commonality between the three boys and Dad, it's that we're all telling stories. My younger brother is writing, children's books, and I did 25 years of TV news, helping tell people stories,
Yeah.
and now because of the network we've built, we're able to help people tell their own stories, and that's really exciting.
I have to ask, is your dad, is he still minister?
Yep, I'm going to call it supply preaching. So every once in a while he'll be called to fill in, and my son Dallas just got married a week ago, and my brother and my dad performed the ceremony, which is
that's very cool.
cool. Yeah.
So does your dad get the opportunity to sit on your brother's sermons and critique him, maybe and some feedback?
You know what? My dad is such an all-loving dad. I'm sure he would, even if he saw something that my brother could improve, he wouldn't say it. He would say, "You did such a great job."
Yeah, that's funny. I don't know if I told you, but my brother, he is in Kansas, and he is a minister.
Oh,
as well.
cool.
And my background is I was a chaplain, so I had the opportunity to be a minister per se in the prison system. So walk us through, you going to school, graduated, and then you started to work in the broadcasting field. Kind of tell us a bit more about that.
Sure. There's kind of a fun story, because I was an intern at the local CBS station in Lansing.
Yeah.
And the internship program was a 10-week internship. And I got it in my mind, Paul, that they were going to give me a job.
Yeah.
They didn't know it yet, but they were going to give me a job at the end of the 10-week internship. So the internship was a free internship in which you essentially weren't getting paid. In fact, you were paying the college for the privilege of working for free. And so in the movie I was running in my mind, the 10 weeks would come and go, and the news director would come up to me, shake my hand, say, "Jeff, you're the best intern we've ever had.
Yeah.
Would you do us the honor of accepting a job?" And the 10 weeks came and went, and Paul, the movie didn't play like I had written it. And so I had a little bit of a crisis. I was like, okay, wait a minute. If I tell the news director the internship is over, I guess I got to leave. But if I don't tell him, I get to stay. So I didn't know how, I hadn't completely thought this out, because at some point you get busted. I was 15 weeks into a 10-week internship when I finally got busted.
Wow.
News director, think Lou Grant, Mary Tyler Moore, kind of a curmudgeon, is walking down the hallway with a cup of coffee, and he's kind of grumbling, Crilley, this is a long internship. When is this thing going to be finally over? And I realized I was busted.
Yeah.
And so I kind of whispered under my voice, it was over 5 weeks ago.
Yeah.
And he turned around and said, say that again? I said, it was over 5 weeks ago. He said, come into my office. So this is the scene in the movie where you get tossed out.
Yeah.
Because I was, technically.
Oh, you think.
So he said, let me get this straight. We're not paying you, right? I said, that's right. And you're not even getting college credit right now. I said, that's correct. He said, what are you doing here?
Yeah.
And I kind of reached into my stomach, and I pleaded with him. I said, don't make me leave. This is the air that I breathe. This is what gets me out of bed in the morning. Please don't make me leave. Yeah. And I think he just saw a hunger he had never seen before, and he gave me a break, and he said, look, we don't have a position for you, but I'm going to make a position for you. Wow. I don't know whether we're going to call you newsroom assistant or executive lackey. I don't know what we're going to call you, but you've got a job. And that intern, the paid position turned into a part-time reporter, and then a full-time reporter and weekend anchor. Wow. But in the beauty of life, that same news director is now turning 90. And this weekend, tomorrow morning, I get on a plane for Lansing, Michigan, because he called me out of the blue 3 months ago and said, would you do me the honor of coming to my 90th birthday party? Yeah. We're going to get some of those same reporters and anchors together. So I have not seen him in 40 years.
How cool is
Isn't that cool?
You were telling the story, and I'm thinking to myself, when you're like, you got busted, and you were like, this is the air that I breathe. And you could almost rephrase it. Do you not know this is God's purpose for my life? Do not deprive me of that. And you brought out something that Napoleon Hill talks about, going the extra mile, being willing to work for free because that's your passion. Yes. And I think people need to hear that when you're trying to discover your purpose. And I don't know at that time, how old were you?
Well, I got my first TV job at 19.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so at that young age, you probably didn't know ultimately what God's purpose was for you, but you knew you wanted to be where you were at. And I think you communicate. I think we all need to understand when we're searching for our purpose. And Jeff kind of gave one of the clues. It's in what you're passionate about. It's really what drives you. And so after that, they offered you a position, which is great.
He did. Yeah. And I remember I called up my father. I had covered my first murder story, right? And that's a big deal for a 19-year-old. Yeah. And then I called up my dad in Detroit, the old-fashioned phones before cell phones. Yeah. And I said, Dad, I just covered this really cool murder. And my dad said, son, I want to hear all about it, but just for future reference, I would never use the word cool and murder in the same sentence. People won't understand. I understand, but continue your story.
That's funny, yes.
So yeah, I loved every minute of the TV news thing, and then kept climbing my way up the TV markets, but at a certain point you get to the top of the little mountain that you're climbing, and the little mountain or hill I was climbing was called local TV news, and I knew they weren't going to make me the main anchor at my most recent station, Channel 4 in Dallas. And I had written a book, and I don't want to get ahead, but the book opened the door for the next chapter in my life, which is public relations. Yeah. Do you want me to tell you more about it?
Please.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in 2002, I was having lunch with a PR person, and she put her press releases on the table, and she said, give me some feedback. Like, what am I doing wrong? And I just kind of laid her out. I said, that's boring. That's horrible. We're too busy to cover that. We'd never cover that. And she said some words that would change my life. She says, you need to write a book. I said, I'm sure there's a million books on PR. She says, yeah, but they're all written by PR people. And so that night I go on Amazon, I start looking through the Bibles of the industry from guerrilla marketing on down. And sure enough, every single book on public relations was written by a PR person, not a news person. Yeah. So I started to get some of these books from Barnes & Noble and read them. And I started to laugh at their advice. I would say that's college professor who
Yeah,
never
yeah,
worked in
yeah,
a newsroom
yeah.
advice. That's not how newsrooms work. So I wrote this book on publicity called Free Publicity, A TV Reporter Shares the Secrets for Getting Covered on the News. And my TV station said, Jeff, how are you planning to promote this thing? I said, well, I figured I'd give some speeches. They said, all right, but be careful. You're a working reporter. We don't want your integrity to be compromised.
Yeah.
You can't take a speaker's fee.
Yeah.
I said, what do you mean? And they said, well, if Exxon paid you 10 grand to speak and then the next day Greenpeace is protesting Exxon, we don't want to worry about you. So speak for free.
Yeah.
And what they unknowingly did was unleash an entrepreneur on the world. I went back to that street hustle that I learned in Detroit. And I said, well, I guess I'll have to make it up in volume. So you're looking at a crazy man who gave 300 speeches a year for 6 straight years in addition to the TV job.
Wow.
Breakfast speech, lunch speech, go to work at Channel 4. Breakfast speech, lunch speech, go to work at Channel 4. I ended up selling 70,000 copies of a $10 book. Typical business book sells fewer than 2,000 copies.
So what was driving you on that? What was the purpose of that?
One, I think part of it was I became addicted to the crowds.
Yeah.
You know, I remember the first time I gave a speech, and speaking to a TV camera and giving a live audience speech is completely different. I remember the first time I gave my first large speech, it might have been like 200 or 300 people to a Chamber of Commerce in Dallas. And I said something that I didn't even consider amusing. It was colorful. I forget exactly what I said, but the whole room laughed. And I looked at that and I said, wow, 200 people who find me that funny. And so then I started to really study the great speakers, the Les Browns and Zig Ziglars, to see what they were doing. And I became a pretty good speaker. But along the way, as you're signing books, it's a public relations book. They're like, hey, Jeff, I can buy your little $10 book. Happy to donate to the cause. But one, I'm probably not going to read the thing. Two, even if I did read it, I'm not going to call CNN or Fox. Can I just hire you? And I said, no, I can't take your money. And I'm on TV. And then occasionally they would say, look, don't throw this card away. This card is worth thousands and thousands of dollars a month to you. Because if I find out I can hire the dude who literally wrote the book on PR, you're hired. So I was smart enough, Paul, that I put a $sign on the card. I kept it in a special envelope at home. So that if I ever pulled the emergency ripcord, these would be the people that I'd go back to. And about the same time I'm doing murders and fires every night, Paul, I was, in TV news, they have an expression, if it bleeds, it leads. And I was the lead story guy at the 9 and 10 o'clock news. So unfortunately, I'm covering grief pretty much every night. And it starts to wear on you. It's the most horrible job in TV news is knocking on somebody's door, saying, I am so sorry for your loss. I can't even imagine what you're going through right now. I'd love to come in and tell the story about what your son's life was like. I mean, it's heart-wrenching. And I think I slowly began to think, am I actually serving humanity right now? Or am I preying on somebody's grief? We all tell ourselves a story. The story that I told myself is the story's going to be on the news, and it can either be crime scene tape in front of somebody's house, or it could be the mom paying tribute to her son. So the story I was telling myself during those 25 years of TV news is, well, at least you're giving them a voice. You're giving her late son a voice. But now I wonder how much I was serving humanity. I like what I'm doing now much better.
Well, we will be right back after this message. Welcome back to On Purpose with Paul. We are here interviewing Jeff Crilley, telling his amazing story. So Jeff, I want you to pick up and tell us a little bit about, because you said you started getting, a little dissatisfaction with what you were doing. And you'd achieved so much in broadcasting.
Yes, I was so honored during my long news career. I won Emmy Awards. I helped free an innocent man from prison. I won, pretty much everything that you can win in TV news. And yet I still felt restless. And so part of that, I think, is God whispering, hey, this chapter might be closing, but there's going to be another chapter that opens up that could be even more special. So I made the decision I was going to walk away from the only thing I knew, right? I mean, think about it, from the time I'm 19 years old to the time I was 45 when I quit. That was the only thing I knew. And your ego gets tied up in it. You're like, oh, you're the TV guy. Or I would go into a restaurant and they would say, you're Jeff Crilley. I watch you on the news. And so walking away from that, I remember writing the letter of resignation. It was like 9 o'clock in the newsroom, and I'm writing this, it's been a great run, but I regret to send this letter to say that I'm going to leave TV news. My finger hovered over the send button for a full minute, Paul. I mean, I remember, gosh, if I push this, I'm not taking it back. I felt like I'm going to be an Olympic swimmer, but somebody actually kind of needs to push me in the pool. Once I get in the pool, I'm gonna be great.
Yeah.
But I was so scared. So Paul, I pressed send, and I felt two contrasting emotions at the same time: exhilaration, and panic. It's the difference between a lion in the zoo and a lion in the wild. A lion in the zoo predictably gets a nice juicy steak at 10 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon. A lion in the wild better learn how to hunt, or the lion doesn't eat. And so again, having given 300 speeches for 6 straight years, I knew I wasn't going to starve. But I said, I guess I got to get busy. I got to hustle. And so I called up all those people who said, I want to be your very first client. Don't throw this card away. And I said, guess what? I'm for hire. And so I started this company in my home, a laptop, cell phone, calling myself a PR firm. In those early days, all I was doing was getting people on the news: Fox, CNN, Wall Street Journal. And it was easy for me. I literally wrote the book on the thing. And so I would just call up these producers at Good Morning America and say, hey, my name is Jeff Crilley. Spent 25 years in news. I've got a great story. Here's what the story's about. Here's what the guy's going to say. And these days, Paul, when you're calling a network, you're talking to a 23-year-old who just graduated from NYU or something like that. So when I said I spent 25 years in news, it's almost like, teach me, Father. I know you're not going to disrespect me. I know you have the right storyline. And then something else that we do is every single morning for the last 16 years, I've gotten up at 5 in the morning to begin my day. And I write a unique email that goes out to 29,000 journalists all over North America into London, England. It's a labor of love. I've not missed a single day in 16 years.
Amazing,
So my flight leaves tomorrow for Lansing to see my old news director. The flight leaves at 8 a.m., which means I got to get to the airport by 7, which means to get the newsletter out, I probably have to wake up at 3 tomorrow morning. I could easily give myself permission to say, the world will not stop spinning if Jeff Crilley missed a day. But I think it's a healthy obsession. It's this, there was a New York Times bestselling book called The Power of Habit. And the power of habit is about, you make one change and you make it sacred. And I will work out every morning. Well, you work out every morning, you lose weight. I'm going to read the Bible. Suddenly your knowledge of the Bible is much better than my knowledge. So I've made this commitment. I am going to do this. And it really helps the company work.
I want to address a couple of things that you had mentioned, because as people are listening to your story, and you left an amazing career, you had hit all the accolades, and people's like, well, why did you give up on that? So many people get settled, but there was something behind you, and we've not talked about this, because I know you have, from what you told me, as an amazing wife, an amazing family, and some of the struggles. 'Cause first question I would ask you is, like, when you were making that decision to push send, what was your wife thinking about this? You're leaving your career.
So my wife had actually watched me, my satisfaction with TV news decline. I remember Katrina, which I believe was 2005. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. So a young Jeff Crilley would race to Katrina. I'm the center of the news universe. I'm going to be hanging around all the network anchors.
Because it was the air that you breathe.
Yes, exactly.
Yes,
when they called me, I remember it was a Sunday, the dams had burst in New Orleans, and the whole bayou was flooding. They said, all right, Jeff, pack your bags, come into work. You're leaving with Ricardo, and we don't know when you're going to come back. We don't know where you're going to stay. We don't know if we can get a hotel for you at this point, but just head east. And she remembers me packing my bags, and my shoulders were slumped as I walked out to my car, because all I could think of is we're all going to be wet and cold. I'll be maybe eating McDonald's and sleeping in a car for the next 5 or 6 days. And when I do get to come back to Dallas, how dare you ask for time off or compensation for the extra days that you worked? And so instead of this being, exciting, it was now a chore. And so I was losing my love for news. She saw it. I married my soulmate. Been together for 23 years.
That's awesome.
And she has supported me in everything.
Yeah. That's amazing. It's interesting as you're reflecting on this, and so many of us need to understand we have a calling, and I shared in the last interview what I refer to as death of a vision, where we have this calling that we feel and as you said, it was the air that you breathe. And you're coming to a point where you lose the passion. And when you lose passion, it's a time for us to reassess, reevaluate. Is this still what I would believe God's purpose is? And, God created you and used your mom and dad as models and mentors to do something even greater, because you got to a point you recognize, I'd gotten the awards, but I didn't have the satisfaction.
Yes.
And now you're having to make a step, what I would call the step of faith, and your wife is fully supportive of that. And so kind of help us understand, you started this company and talk about that.
Yeah. So, well, at one point when I wrote the book, I was deep in debt.
Yeah.
And we were just 3 weeks from getting married, and I had been lying about how much I owed. I did the dumbest thing you can ever do, Paul. I mean, I've been much dumber than anybody else that I know. The .com thing was happening.
Yeah.
And just as the bubble was bursting, I got into the stock market. But if you kind of remember those times, they were like, it's just a healthy pullback. It's just a healthy correction. Yeah. So I started borrowing on credit cards to bet on a stock market that was kind of in a free fall. Yeah. And so I had been telling my wife stories about, I owe a little bit of money. And 3 weeks before we get married, she says, how much do you owe again? And I couldn't remember the lie from the last time. Yeah. And so I threw out a number that didn't work, and it was like she completely saw through me. And I suddenly didn't have words, and I sank down on the floor of this little apartment we were living in, and I started crying like a baby. And I really thought she would walk out on me. I mean, who wants to marry this guy? Yeah. But she hugged me, and she says, we're going to get through this together. And we're going to take you to CCCS, and we're going to cut up your credit cards. And she was my first investor because I had to borrow money from her to print the book. Yeah. And I remember, my motivation in those early days was to make my wife proud. Yeah. And then we I don't know why we thought this was a good idea, or maybe I was too cheap. We had 5,000 books bound with glue in our bedroom, stacked up. And in the middle of the night, if my wife went to go to the bathroom, she would stub her toe on the books and curse the books. And so I was bound and determined to sell those books and pay back my first investor. And so I did, got out of debt, started to make money. And now I think she's just tremendously proud to see this company that she's, she believed in. Yeah. She was the first one to believe. And now I work with my kids. My daughter's my vice president. My son's head of business development. I know I don't look old enough. I have a 13-year-old grandson. Yeah. He wants to take over the company one day. So people say, what's your happiness 1 to 10? I always say 12. Yeah. Like, what would make me happier? I get to tell people stories and Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. You started with broadcasting be the air that you breathe. How would you describe what you were experiencing? One, when the gentleman gave you the opportunity, you lost your passion, and now you're, what I believe, really fulfilling God's purpose.
Thank you.
I mean, is it still the air that you breathe, but in a different way?
It is in a much better way, because now I see myself as I'm lighting candles that are lighting other candles. So you and I became friends a few weeks ago, and you've been here recording episodes, several times. Yeah. You're putting spotlights on other people instead of Jeff Crilley putting spotlights on people. So I think the world can be a much brighter place if we're all lighting candles. Yeah. And I just appreciate what you're doing with your show, because I think you found your purpose. Yes. And the way I'm watching you as a professional interviewer myself. You have a very gentle spirit.
Thank you.
Your questions all come from a very good place, a curious place.
Yeah.
And I can tell you're incredibly well read. You're quoting books that I'm like, I wanted to read that book. I should probably get around to reading that book. So anyway, I'm loving this interview, and I love the way you ask questions.
Well, I appreciate it. So I wanted you to talk about, because you've had what I would call three major periods of your life. Your childhood and watching your dad, your mom and your dad, and how they raised and served. And then you had the period where you were living out your dream of being a broadcaster, and then got to a point where I feel like I have to do something with a higher purpose, because you were serving Jeff Crilley as a broadcaster and getting the things. And anytime we serve our own desires, they end up being not what we thought they were going to be. Yes. And I just sense that you moved into a new direction since you started this new company. You're moving to a higher purpose. And it's not about Jeff Crilley. It's about how can I bless other people to see their dreams come true.
Yes.
And so I want to talk about that. But before we do, I want us to go to a break. And we will be right back to hear the final story of Jeff Crilley and the legacy he's going to leave. Thank you. Welcome back to On Purpose with Paul. We are here to hear the final version of Jeff Crilley's story and his legacy.
So I'll tell you, our company is divided into two parts. One is like, get me on Fox, get me on CNN, get me in USA Today. And then the other part of the company is, why do we need the media's permission? Can't we just become the media? Can't we tell our own stories? And so this is kind of a fun story. My daughter is my vice president. She comes to me 5 years ago and she says, Daddy, we need to get into podcasting. And I laughed at her. I said, podcasting? Who listens to podcasts? She says, my generation, Dad. All those kids on the Katy Trail listening to stuff, it's not music. You got to trust me. And so you can see my frame of view. I'm Colonel Sanders. I'm doing chicken right. She came to me with Chinese food. This is a completely different industry, podcasting. They don't really work together. And I just, something in, I'm sure it was God, I just gave her grace. And I said, okay, don't go crazy. So she spends about $2,000 on a little GoPros, a board, nothing fancy. I'm ignoring her. I'm working on Fox, CNN, the big stuff. She's got her little division. There were 5 clients the first month, second month, 10 clients, third month, 15 clients. Suddenly it got my attention. And then I noticed something, Paul. I noticed that the people in the podcast division were so happy. In the news division, people can get fickle. They can say, oh yeah, you got me on the national news, but it was only 3.5 minutes, which kind of drives me crazy because that's not my candy store. I noticed that people in the podcast division were so happy. Like they got to talk for 30 to 45 minutes. They got to interview their friends or people that they were meeting. And so that's when the light bulb went off. As an entrepreneur, I said, what would happen if I spent some money? So I've spent $2 million on television studios, and now my studios are prettier than anything this side of the Today Show. I mean, we happen to be in a studio that I nicknamed Oprah. It can fit up to 70 people in the studio audience. It's the only place in Dallas-Fort Worth where you could have a live studio audience. And so now people are flying in from New York and LA, knocking out a bunch of content and leaving. We do all of it, and if you don't mind, I'll put in a shameless plug, $500 an episode. People come in, we do all the editing, uploading, and tagging for $500. If you went to Channel 8 in Dallas to try and get the same thing done, they're going to charge you $20,000. So thank God Sarah came up with this crazy idea of podcasting, because I truly believe this is the future. As the media is losing viewers, it happens every day, losing readership, along comes the rise of social media, where right now, if we went to YouTube and put in teenage makeup tips, you'd see a 13-year-old girl showing you how to do eyebrows with 3 million subscribers. Well, CBS Evening News only gets about 800,000. So how can a 13-year-old girl doing eyebrows beat a 100-year-old institution like the CBS News? It's because the game is changing.
Well, you had mentioned earlier, I think you used the term bleed leads.
Yes.
And it's interesting because the news industry is all about making money, and they will often put out those types of stories which are not leaving people inspired, not giving people hope. And it ends up having a negative impact on our society, and it creates a level of division within people. And one of the things that I so admire about you is, like you said, a visionary entrepreneur always sees in the future and begins to work backwards to see how can we then change the trajectory.
Yes.
And your real news has really began to change that trajectory and give people a voice to tell their story.
Yes.
And like mine and some of the others that you interview, it's a story of inspiration, it's a story of hope.
And you're not having some young producer, some 23-year-old producer saying, no, Paul, you can't do a show like that. It would upset too many advertisers. No, we can't do a show like that because it wouldn't get the ratings.
Yes.
And that's the problem with the mainstream media in general, is so many of the decisions they're making are based on, would we get ratings? And so, I mean, one of the problems with social media is half of the stuff people are saying on social media, I think they're saying it to get more likes and retweets. Yeah. And you get more likes and retweets if you're ugly, if you're nasty, if you make a funny comment about somebody.
Yeah.
So the rhetoric in America has just gotten crazy.
Yes.
And I'm hoping through giving everybody their own platform where they don't have to listen to advertisers, they can tell really powerful stories that the media would never tell.
Yeah. Well, it kind of takes me back, when I was in high school, when I was bullied, is, the people who had the loudest voice were the people who were most popular. And so it's like, and sometimes they were, the term mean girls, the kind of concept. But I believe that the tide is changing because people want a more positive message. And I think your network provides that positive network and gives people, like for my show, it's like, yes, my show has a lot to do with faith, but I think one of the things that I really encourage people is, and I believe it's probably the number one question is, what am I here for? What am I created? And I use my show to give people that opportunity to, one, solidify their foundation of what they think they're here for.
Yes.
And on the searching, asking the questions, they begin to discover, like your story. Because when you were, 5 years old, you didn't know that you ultimately would be sitting here today and have a company that gives people their opportunity, their voice. And so you've been able to, I believe, discover God's purpose in the choices that you've made. And then having people like your parents, your wonderful wife, your kids, and all these people that you work for. Because I've been here just one other time, but I've sensed the spirit of family within this. And talk more a little bit about that. You've created an environment here.
Sure. So there's a conference room that I've taken over as my office, and the lighting is just soft and gentle, and there's a spirit here. So as a business decision, we've just decided there's no toxic energy allowed in here, both on the client side and on the employee side. And so, Paul, it used to stress me out. When I hit the door here at 9 a.m, it's back-to-back meetings. So I'm often pulled in different directions. And it used to stress me out when somebody came in for a meeting with me, but I had to be in this other meeting. And so I just said, okay, well, God, maybe these people are supposed to know each other. And you've been a part of this.
Yeah.
And I call it spiritual stew, where I bring these people into the conference room who don't know each other. We go around, we introduce ourselves to each other. Inevitably, there's going to be somebody who says, oh my goodness, you do that? Well, I need your card. And so I call it spiritual stew because I didn't do anything but bring the pot and the water. You brought some carrots, you brought a side of beef. I know the stew is going to be delicious.
Yeah.
I just don't know what the ingredients are because it's whoever shows up in that room.
Yeah.
And so people have said to me, Jeff, you do have a ministry here.
Yeah.
You're giving people voices, giving people attention, and I'll go back to the thing that I said earlier in the broadcast. We all just want to be seen.
Yeah.
I mean, there are people who they're driven to become the CEO of this amazing company, and they hate their life because they were driving to get approval from a father or a mother or something like that. And so I love what you're doing with your show, because essentially you're boiling down to what's your why? Why do you do what you do? It's not about money. It's not about getting the private jet. It's about serving humanity.
Yeah, yeah. So as we near the end here, what's the greatest honor for you as you reflect back on all the decisions and where you're at now, and really what is your why, and just the things, because I think it really comes down to, and you've lived a full life. I really believe that when you face your maker, he's going to say, well done, thou good and faithful servant. But you have more work to do.
Thank you.
So what's left for Jeff Crilley?
Well, I'll tell you a story that you just reminded me of. So Nick Vujicic was born with no arms and no legs. He's one of the most popular speakers on the planet. I had the privilege of interviewing him on my show. Then we became friends. And then I asked him if he needed a publicist. And I said, pro bono, I'd just like to be around you. This is 2 years ago, and the National Religious Broadcasters Conference was in town at the Gaylord. And he didn't need a publicist that day. He needed an order taker because everybody wanted to talk to him. And so my job was basically, okay, you can get him for 15 minutes on your podcast, but then I need him down on the convention floor because Newsmax needs him at 1:30. I was an order taker. Well, there was a little downtime. And Nick, I learned he loves people. He gets energy from people. It doesn't drain his energy. He was getting more energy the whole time. So there was a little downtime. I kept asking, do you want to go back to the room and rest up? And he says, no. I'm supposed to meet some people. So he's over taking pictures with a couple. I'm at least 15 yards away. And I'm just smiling, my biggest smile. Nobody's around me. And these two evangelists came up to me and they said, what's your deal? I said, what's my deal? They said, we see God on your face. And I got goosebumps. I was like, wow, that may be the highest compliment I've ever been paid. And they said, well, we prayed. We're from Florida, and we had a full day scheduled, and we asked God what he wanted us to do, and God told us to be obedient and clear away all the appointments. So we cleared away our appointments, and we've been going around praying with people. And later that day, I saw them put their arms on people and pray with people. And they said, okay, so why are you so happy? Why we feel God's presence around you. Why are you so happy? And I said, well, I got a cool company. I get to work with my kids. I get to work with Nick Vujicic. And they said, well, tell me about your company. I said, well, we get people on Fox, CNN, Wall Street Journal, and we make TV shows for people. They said, you make TV shows for people. Show me, what does that look like? And then I pulled out my phone and showed them, probably the Oprah studio. And they said, wow, this is truly a God thing, because we've been talking about trying to do a television show, and we haven't found studios that would accommodate us. And they said, when could we come over to look? I said, sure. So this is like a Tuesday or something like that. And I said, come over anytime. They said, our plane leaves Friday afternoon. We'll come by Friday morning. So they came in here, saw all of this, and became clients. So they'd fly in from time to time and knock out a bunch of content. But the reason I'm even telling you that story is it wasn't like Jeff Crilley was running around the convention floor passing out pamphlets. I was actually just being obedient and smiling my biggest smile. And business came to me. So if I could leave your viewers with kind of a moral of the story, we all want to pay the light bill. We all have stuff that we have to do to make money. But sometimes you need to just live your best life, have a big smile, let the business come to you.
Well said. I'm telling you, that is a great way to finish the show, Jeff.